that the next decade belongs to India. So what do we make of such pronouncements? In many ways, the political and social consequences of the BJP's rule, such as the slide towards autocracy, rising communal polarization, and the crackdown on dissent, are well understood in academic scholarship and have been reported on in alternative media and to an extent in the international media as well. But there is much less consensus about the BJP's economic record, barring, of course, episodes such as demonetization of the currency in 2016 or during COVID-19 when economic distress was so obvious that it was hard to ignore. Now, there are not only differences of opinion about the BJP's economic performance, but also genuine lack of clarity about the impact of its economic policies. And there are good reasons for why this lack of clarity exists. First, there is triumphalism abounding, not only in the BJP's electoral campaigns, but also in the mainstream national media, which is faithfully reproducing official claims and talking points. So often we are hearing reports about the length of the highways constructed, airports built, India's high growth rate, and its ascent to become the world's fifth largest economy. So it becomes quite hard to separate fact from fiction in the face of a full-scale PR assault. Second, the yardstick by which we evaluate development depends on what we mean by development. So official narratives would have us believe that economic growth and infrastructure are the most important things to focus on. But in a country in which almost 600 million people live below the median poverty line and hunger and malnutrition are widely prevalent, the critical question is who is benefiting from this growth, if growth is indeed as high as it's claimed? And is it translating into good jobs, higher wages, and better health and educational outcomes for many, or simply enriching a narrow social class? Third, robust economic data are needed to critically assess the performance of any government, and this government has unfortunately distinguished itself by either not conducting important economic surveys, suppressing surveys that don't fit its narrative, or changing the methodology used to collect data, which make them incomparable over time. So this has obstructed, but not entirely thwarted attempts to hold the government to account. So the current situation works well for the BJP, or we'll see how it pans out. But it also very often in popular discourse, the politics and economics of the BJP are siloed. And today, our eminent panelists will help us to separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, by assessing the developmental record of the BJP and analyzing how its economics and Hindu nationalist politics are linked. So I would now like to introduce our panelists, and I will introduce them in the order in which they will speak. Dreze will start us off, and Jean is a development economist and currently visiting professor at Ranchi University and honorary professor at the Delhi School of Economics. He has made wide-ranging contributions to development economics and public policy with special reference to India. His recent books include An Uncertain Glory, India and Its Contradictions with Amartya Sen, and Sense and Solidarity, Jholawala Economics for Everyone. Jean is also active in various campaigns for economic and social rights. Nitin Kumar Bharti is a postdoctoral scholar in the economics department of New York University, Abu Dhabi. He is also coordinator for South and Southeast Asia at the World Inequality Lab at the Paris School of Economics. He received his PhD from the University of Namur and the Paris School of Economics in 2022. Before that, he earned his bachelor's degree from IIT Kharagpur and has 2 years experience working in the corporate sector. He's an applied microeconomist, and his research interests lie in understanding the educational system and its linkage to economic growth and inequality. And he's also interested in studying long-term evolution of inequalities in South Asia. Dipa Sinha is assistant professor of economics at Ambedkar University. She works on issues related to food rights and nutrition, public health, gender and social policy. She has worked for over 5 years with the Office of Commissioners to the Supreme Court on the right to food. She has been a part of a number of national and international research studies on food from JNU, on food rights, health, financing, gender, and social development. She has done her MA in economics from JNU, MSc in development studies from SOAS in London, and PhD also from JNU, New Delhi. And last but not the least, Jayati Ghosh is an Indian development economist who is professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst in the US. She previously taught at JNU New Delhi for more than 30 years. She has authored or edited over 20 books and regularly writes columns on economics for Frontline and other prominent publications in India and around the world. She was founder secretary of the International Development Economics Associates for 20 years and is one of the founders of the Economics Research Foundation in New Delhi. She has advised and consulted with many governments and international organizations and is a member of 2 high-level boards of the United Nations. So with this, I now invite Jean to start us off. Jean has a PowerPoint that he'll be sharing with us.
Later if at all.
Okay, later if at all. All right, so I hand over to you now, Jean.
Okay, so I thought I should start from the question that has been posed, which is, are Hindu nationalists good for the economy? And my first reaction to this question is, I don't care, because the big danger of Hindu nationalism is not that the economy will slow down. It is the damage that Hindu nationalism can do to Indian society, including the destruction of democracy, which is already happening rapidly and could happen to a much greater extent in the near future. Having said this, I'm happy to consider the question in its own terms. It's not an easy question to answer, because the ideologues of Hindu nationalism, so far as I know, have not said very much at all about economic policy. And if we look at the economic policies of the Modi government, which are, of course, influenced by Hindu nationalism, at first sight, they don't look very different from those of its predecessor, the UPA government. There are big differences in social policy. I have talked and written about that on earlier occasions, but I think today Dipa will talk about this, so I'll skip that. In terms of economic policy, as I said, at first sight, there are no major differences. The reason may be that the lobbies, pressure groups, consultants, and ghost policymakers who are driving these policies are much the same today as before. But on closer look, there are some differences. For example, I think that there is a streak of irrationality in the economic policies of the BJP that was not there before. We can see that irrationality in the aversion to facts, the destruction of the statistical system. I think that Jayati will perhaps talk a little bit more about that. The mumbo jumbo that pervades the annual economic surveys, which used to be serious documents, the sidelining of serious economic advisors. And we can see it, of course, in a dramatic way in the demonetization blunder of 2016, which was a huge act of voodoo economics. This irrationality, I think, is one symptom of the general hostility to rational thinking and critical inquiry in Hindu nationalism. This hostility is not an accident. It is only by suppressing critical thinking that you can get most people to believe the irrational and unscientific ideas of Hindu nationalism, whether it is the idea that the rishis of ancient India were flying airplanes, or that plastic surgery was used to stitch Ganesha's head to a human body, or that the North Pole used to be in Bihar, or more importantly, that all Hindus share one country, one race, one religion, one culture, and even one language, as was argued by Guruji Golwalkar, one of the founding fathers of the RSS. Now, there are other differences as well. For example, the drive to centralization under the BJP, which is again related to this attempt to impose a uniform culture and uniform norms across the country, the revival of protectionism and so on. More importantly, I think that the BJP has created a new symbiosis between the central government and the business class. And to understand this symbiosis, I think that we have to remember, first of all, that Hindu nationalism, although it is usually seen as a majoritarian movement, and it is from a certain perspective, it is also fundamentally a movement of the privileged minority. I mean by that the upper classes and the upper caste, which is more or less the same in India. But I think that the caste angle is also very important in its own right. All the founders of the RSS, which is the torchbearer of Hindu nationalism, were Brahmins. For a long time, all the RSS Pracharaks were Brahmins. All the Satsang Chalaks, the supremos of the RSS, so far have been Brahmins, except one who was a Rajput. And according to the writer Bhawan Megwanshi, who used to be a member of the RSS, in 2003, out of 36 members of the National Working Committee of the RSS, 34 were upper caste and 24 were Brahmins. So this is the privileged minority that is now in control, bearing in mind that the BJP is effectively a wing of the RSS. And coming back to the more specific nexus between the central government and the business class, this nexus is based on a very simple quid pro quo. The business class bankrolls the BJP, and the BJP reciprocates with business-friendly policies like corporate subsidies, land grants, debt waivers, protective tariffs, stimulus packages, and environmental clearances. Incidentally, this quid pro quo has been greatly facilitated by the electoral bonds. I don't have time to talk about that, but we can go into that later if there's any interest. It has greatly facilitated this quid pro quo between the corporate class and the ruling party. So in short, I think the main thing we can say about the economic policies of Hindu nationalists is that they love business. That's what we can say as of now. And I'm saying as of now, because I don't think we have seen Hindu nationalism in full force yet. We have seen a kind of trailer. And if it actually comes in full force, we will see much bigger things like perhaps a change of constitution, children reading the Manusmriti in school and that sort of thing. But that is not happening yet. But as of now, I think that the main feature of the economic policies of Hindu nationalists is that they love business. And then the question is, and I think that's what we're going to address today mainly, is what does that do to the economy and more importantly, to the Indian people? I think the other speakers are going to speak about that in detail. I'll just show a couple of slides to dispel the myth that Sheba has referred to earlier, that the economy is booming in an unprecedented way under Modi and that people's living conditions are improving like never before. That is simply not true. It doesn't stand scrutiny. So I'll just show a couple of slides to dispel that myth and then let other speakers go into much more detail into the economic and social policies of the Modi government. So I'm now trying to share my screen. Here we go. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. So, yeah. So I'm just showing three very simple macroeconomic indicators to dispel the myth I've just referred to. These are the growth rates of national income, growth rates of real consumption expenditure, and growth rates of agricultural wages. This is all official government data. So you can see that the growth of national income has slowed down under Modi compared to the previous 10 years. The growth of consumption expenditure has slowed down even more. And that contrast would be even greater if you look at per capita consumption expenditure. These are not per capita figures. And most importantly, and this is really what I want to emphasize, is that the growth of real wages has come to a virtual standstill in the last 10 years. I think this is very important, and we must pay much more attention to real wages because, for one thing, they are much easier to measure than poverty or unemployment. There are endless discussions of comparatively unhelpful unemployment or even poverty estimates that really don't tell us very much, for example, because poor people really can't afford to do nothing when they don't have a good job, so they fall back on survival activities like selling eggs in the street or pulling a rickshaw and then they are counted as employed in the household surveys, but they are not really properly employed in any meaningful sense of the term. So if actually there was a serious demand for employment, and if employment was growing steadily, we would see an increase in real wages. And that was happening before the BJP came to power. And it has come more or less to a standstill. I don't know any other experience of a country growing so rapidly for as long as 10 years without a substantial impact on real wages. These are agricultural wages, but the same applies pretty much across the board in the informal sector. Here you can see 3 groups of occupations: agricultural labor, construction workers, and non-agricultural labor. Same pattern, more or less. And here you can see the same data again in a longer time span. This was published in The Economist. It's attributed to the CMIE, but I think it's based again on the Labor Bureau data. So you can see more clearly how the steady growth of real wages that was happening before the BJP came to power came to an end after that. So this does not mean that poverty decline necessarily stops under the BJP, because even if the real wages are stagnating, in principle, you can still earn more by moving across occupations to the better paid occupations, or for that matter, moving to the states with higher wages, as many people are doing today by migrating to Kerala and Tamil Nadu and so on and so forth. So, and also, even if your earnings are not growing, I mean, poor people continue to save and invest some of their earnings and improve their houses and the facilities that they have and so on. So it's not surprising, and also the education levels continue to increase and so on. So it's not surprising that there has been some continued poverty decline under Modi, but at a quite modest rate, according to the latest study on this by Peter Lanyu and his colleagues. Poverty was the headcount ratio, the proportion of people below the poverty line, was declining at about 2 percentage points per year between 2004-05 and 2011-12, but only about half a percentage point per year after that. So this is just to dispel the myth of unprecedented economic success and unprecedented improvement in living conditions under Modi. And that's just a starter. I will let other speakers talk in more detail about economic and social policies, and also about inequality, because the growth of inequality under the BJP government is another important development that we must talk about. So I'll stop here and look forward to listening to the other speakers. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John. You were well within time. In fact, you had another minute or two to go. So thank you very much. And thank you for this very wide-ranging, sort of broad overview that is very helpful to set the stage. And thank you also for clarifying that we don't need the Hindu nationalists to underperform on the economy to not support them and not vote for them, because absolutely that there are very good reasons to not support a Hindu nationalist political party, even otherwise. So thank you for setting the stage. And now I invite Nitin, Kumar, Bharti to talk to us about inequality.
Yeah, thank you. I will share my slides. So yes, let me begin by thanking the organizer for giving me this opportunity to come on the same screen with eminent panelists. I'm going to talk more about the unequal distribution of growth. And given my background, I'll be taking a bit more long-run historical approach to talk about it. So in my talk, I'm going to touch upon 2 points, which is sort of linked with what John mentioned about. First is the rising economic inequality in India, where it has reached to an extreme level today. And second, where I will show that these inequalities have strong overlap with the existing social inequalities, where I will look into the graded disparity by caste, and this caste disparity and discrimination has been super persistent in recent years. So let me start first by showing the economic inequality and its rise in recent years. So here in this graph, which is taken from this recently published work on top income and wealth inequality, in India. with Luca, Thoma, and Anmol. So here in this graph, you can see the top 1% income share, that how much of the top 1% of the population earns in India as share of aggregate national income. We can see 100 years here from 1922 to 2022. And it has a nice U-shaped curve where in the beginning, during the colonial times, the highest inequality or the highest top 1% share was 21%. It starts declining afterwards, and the lowest top 1% share is in 1980s when it is about 6%. And since then, there is a consistent increase where today it stands at around 22.5%. That is, top 1% of population earns 22.5% of national income. And this is higher than the highest what was present during British Raj. And this is what we call in paper is that today this billionaire Raj, the inequality in billionaire Raj is higher than the British Raj. Now, on top of this, let's put the top 1% wealth share, where here now there is this red curve, which is about the top 1% wealth share. That is how much of wealth is owned by top 1% of the population. The graph starts from 1961 until now. And again, it follows broadly same pattern where there is a bit of decline until 1980s. And post that, it starts picking up. Before 2014, it sort of stabilized at around 34%, which is sort of the highest here. Post 2014, one very peculiar trend is that it continues to rise to reach to 40% now. That is, top 1% of population own 40% of the national wealth. And this has been, as you can see here, this level of inequality is extreme compared to Indian historical past. Or later on, we will see that this is also one of the extremes when we compare across different countries in the world. Now, the question is, if top 1%, and so of course in the paper we look at the entire distribution, how wealth and income is distributed, the first question comes to mind is that if top 1% or top 10% is gaining, then who are losers? Who are losing? And what we show in paper that it is the middle class. And by middle class, we mean that the middle 40% by income or wealth, which has lost the most in long run. So from 1950 until now, they have lost about 16 percentage point in terms of their shares. And in the last decades, they have lost around 3 to 2 percentage point. Now, bottom 50%, their level is already now at such a low level that probably there is less scope to extract further from them. Now, if we compare this inequality with other, let's say, comparable countries, what we find is that in terms of top 1% income shares, it is much higher than the US, Brazil, South Africa, or China. Or the same thing applies when we look at from the perspective of top 1% wealth share. Now here, one interesting country is China, where we see that based on top 1% wealth share, it is 33% in China and 40% in India. Now, why I say this country is interesting, of course, because they are similar in size and so on. But one of the argument which is often given is that the rising inequality is a phenomena of, or let's say as an outcome of rising growth. And here, if we compare China and India, until 1980s in long run, actually they had very similar macro indicator. In post 1980s, China started rising at a very fast pace. And today, of course, so here you can see the graph between comparing China with respect to India, and around in 75-80, they were similar. Today, China gross national income per capita is around 2.5 times than of India. So China indeed has grown at a much faster rate than India. But where sort of India has the, where India sort of is ahead of China is in inequality. Now here in this graph, when we look at top 10% income share or top 1% income share in China and India, and when we compare them, we find that it is much higher in India as compared to China. The second argument to sort of thwart the is that when we look at in recent years, we find that there is positive growth in India. So here in this graph, we can see real year-on-year growth rates, and it is positive, but over time it is slowing down. So what Sean was showing, that overall in NDA time there is less growth, and here year on year we can see that. So there is sort of the growth rate is lesser, but still during this time period we see that the inequality is rising. So the extreme inequality is not entirely due to high growth, which is often given the reason. Now, there are, of course, lots of potential reasons behind it, and I'm not going to talk right now about all of it, but one, indeed, like I think the major portion of this inequality is coming from these deep-rooted structural inequalities based on caste and religion in India, which is now showing up in terms of money, basically. So here, now I come to the second part of the talk where I am going to talk about intergroup inequality in India. Let me begin first by showing the population share of two salient social groups, one based on caste and another based on religion. So based on last census 2011, Hindu population, which is majority, is around 80%. Muslims are 14%, and the rest of the other religion, they form around 6%. Now, compared to 1951, it is true that Hindu population has declined 4 percentage point, and Muslim population correspondingly has increased by 4 percentage point. But when we look at within Hindu, when we look at scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, and other backward class, we find that their population share today stands at 17% for SC, 9% for ST, and 44% for OBC. Now, if we compare this with 1951 census, now OBC were not captured in 1951, so I am comparing OBC population share based on 2002 survey. But in 1951, SCs were 15% and STs were 6%. And in OBC population share in 2002 was 40%. So one of the argument, which is often debated upon, is that Muslim population is growing, and recent working paper which has come up showing that Muslim population has increased by 40%. It is true, but it is also true that within Hindus, ST population has grown by 50%, SC population has grown by 13%, and OBC population in last for 20 years has grown by 10%. Now, next, if we want to understand how these different caste groups and religion looks in terms of their average income. So today, I mean, for many who know Indian context, it will not be a surprise that if we, based on average income or consumption, if we put them into increasing order, we will find that STs, SCs, Muslims, their averages are below the national averages, and forward castes and rest of other religion, they are more than the average, more than the national averages. Here, one thing which I found surprising was that even based on education, for example, if we look at Muslims, their education level is actually, when compared to national average, their average education is lower. So here it's minus 1.4 shows that their average years of education is 1.4 less than 8, which is the national average. Now, what is surprising, another surprising fact here is that, so I also look into this wealth gap. So let's say you have these different castes and religion, we know their population share. We also, based on survey, we also know how much wealth they own. And so if we sort of take the difference between wealth and population share, this is what I'm calling wealth gap, that how much less or more they own with respect to their own population. And here we find that STs, scheduled tribes, they have 5 percentage point less wealth, SCs 10 percentage point less, OBCs 4 percentage point less, Muslims 2 percentage point less. Again, it might not be surprising, but what is surprising here is the persistence that from from 1991 until 2018, these different survey years, when it allows comparability, it has remained pretty much stagnant. So India is growing at a much faster rate, but these gaps are not narrowing down. And it's a new sort of piece. Yesterday, I was looking into wealth share by caste in Forbes list. Now, Forbes provide you the billionaire list, and based on names, of course, I mean, there could be questions about sort of, there will be some measurement error in terms of classification into OBCs and SCs. But if we just focus on this super wealthy population, and if we try to understand how much wealth is distributed among that rich group, here it is much starker that you have, for the general class, they own about 90% of the total wealth. OBCs and SCs are less than 10%, even though their population, to remind you, is 45%, and SCs they own 2-3%. And STs, there is no billionaire in ST, so you do not have any share for them. Now, this was with respect to wealth, but there are lots of other studies which have shown the same sort of disparity and discrimination and its persistence over time, using all the different surveys from 1980s onwards, based on consumption, based on wage, income, firm ownership, and they all have found a sort of similar story. Now, let me just put it like these two pieces. So one, where you have SC, ST, OBC Muslims, their population is increasing, but we also find that they perform worse in welfare indicators. They're usually they're usually found in the lower socioeconomic categories. And so here, I just wanted to make this argument about this new working paper, which has come up and which has taken which has reached to this conclusion that, and I quote here directly from the paper, that careful analysis of data shows that minorities, in the paper they mean Muslims, are not just protected, but indeed thriving in India. This, I would say, is very wrong and misleading inference. If we just look at the population share, it might be true in 1800 or so, when just looking at the population growth, one could reach to this argument, because here the underlying hypothesis that the population share increase is a cumulative outcome measure of their well-being is certainly not true today. Okay, so I'll just wrap it up with this takeaway that in recent years, the development is very, very much inequality enhancing. It has strong linkage with societal discrimination. And I think the government fallacy here is ignoring this rising inequality, almost currently in denial mode, and there is no sort of a long-term plan to tackle it. In future, it might have several negative consequences, starting from actually decrease in the economic growth, restricting further socioeconomic mobility, which might lead to intergenerational inequality, which to begin with probably today is very high. And we can talk about later about the instruments of change and some policies. And I guess, yeah, I should stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nitin. That was really very illuminating talk. And you showed us that polarization in India is increasing, not just, say, on the basis of religion, but also sharply along the lines of class. And that there is not only stark intergroup inequalities, but that these intergroup inequalities have tended to persist very strongly over time. So there's really a systematic kind of angle to this that we really need to look at. And talking about the government's position, just a couple of economic surveys back, the claim was made that growth in India is poverty reducing and inequality is sort of part of the process of growth. So that does not need to be addressed separately. So it is true that the government really does not feel like inequality is an issue to be tackled head on with policy. But anyway, I will now ask Dipa Sinha to talk to us about social policy and welfare. So Dipa, if you want to upload your slides. And in the meanwhile, I just want to remind members of the audience that you can put down your questions in the chat, and then we'll come to you in the Q&A in the last half an hour. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheba. I'll just put my slides up in a minute. just taking forward the discussion, my 10 to 12 minutes I'll be spending on looking at what the welfare policies of this government have been, the last two governments of NDA and Modi, and taking on from what we've been discussing about firstly the inequality is rising, real wages are stagnant, and therefore the role of these social policies becomes even more important. Of course, they're always required, but in this context where you see that the lower quintiles of the population are not doing very well, how these services are provided and what kind of social security they're providing becomes even more important to how their lives are affected. I think it's also important because there is a certain impression created in many quarters by this government that they've set right the welfare system in the country. It's also been called the new welfarism, where all benefits directly reach individuals. And there's a lot of political analysis also about how it is this kind of welfare that is giving them the support that they see in elections as well. So is it really true that there has been this great expansion in welfare services, and that earlier everything was corrupt and nothing reached people, and now that actually all these services get to people? So if we look at firstly what are these new services, one sees that there's nothing really new. Toilet construction of houses for the poor, gas cylinder distribution. These are all schemes which existed earlier, but now these are flagship programs of the Prime Minister, and they're all branded under the Prime Minister's name. And it is true that there is some increase in expenditure on these. But on the other hand, we see two things that are happening. One is this discussion around freebies, which the Prime Minister himself sort of started, where while there is this distribution of what might fit into a definition of freebies in terms of toilets and gas cylinders, it's also this discussion on how this government does not believe in freebies and it is empowering people. And the initial slogan in 2014 was maximum governance, minimum government. And that is something that they are staying with throughout these last 10 years. So if we look at the budget allocation figures, and that is quite telling for some basic sectors like health and education, when we look at them as a proportion of GDP or as a proportion of the total budget allocated for these sectors, you see that as a proportion of the GDP, that is the lower line in orange, the union government's allocation to health has actually been declining. And it is from 14-15 as well, this government began, where it was at its peak after about 10 years of the National Health Mission, which was started in 2005 by the previous government. And there's a slight increase in the COVID year, and much of this went to the COVID vaccination. But even after the COVID pandemic, which kind of devastated India in many ways and showed the lacunae in the health system, we see that the allocations for health has been actually going down as a proportion of GDP and also as a proportion of the total central budget. This in the context where spending on health in India is anyway amongst the lowest in the world in terms of the proportion of GDP. And this is just the central budget. Of course, if you add on states, it becomes higher, but both put together as well, we still spend much less than what is required, about half of what our own policy documents state. We see the same story in education, where the previous government during UPA, you did see some increase in spending and some new initiatives being put in place, including the Right to Education Act that was passed. But over the last 10 years, you see a declining priority to the education sector, where again, as a proportion of the GDP, as well as the total amount of expenditure of the central government, the allocations to this sector has been going down. Now, what does this mean for outcomes? That's a difficult thing to say and make that link. One, also because we don't have very much data in the recent years, but we do have some figures. For instance, if you look at the improvements in enrollment rates, I'm sorry, I don't have the table here, but if you look at improvements in enrollment rates in high school and higher education, there is a sort of stagnation, and the kind of improvement we saw in the previous 10 years is something that we don't see anymore. It's not just that as a proportion of the GDP and budget that spending has been reducing. Certain other schemes, welfare schemes, which are very critical, which I have a list of here, have seen sharp declines in real terms in the budgetary allocation to these programs. The PM Poshan, the first one, is the midday meal scheme, the school midday meal scheme, which actually has seen a reduction of 45% in real terms in the budget. And we all know how important a school midday meal is not just for addressing classroom hunger, but for ensuring regular attendance, nutrition, socialization of children, so many other things. ICTS is the Integrated Child Development Scheme, which is the only program we have for children focusing on children under 6. Once again, a 1/3 reduction in real times in the budget allocated to this program. The National Social Assistance Program is pensions for old people, widows, and disabled, again in real terms, a reduction by 20%. So if you look at, and the other schemes are to do with universal school, primary education, middle school education, and a nutrition program, all of these, while they have been rebranded with the Prime Minister's name in many of these, in terms of budgetary allocations, you see that the central government has been reducing its budgets as a proportion of GDP, as a proportion of their total spending, as well as if we just look at in real terms, what is being allocated to each of these, which are quite essential. And while I said we don't have enough data and analysis for the recent period, we do have for the period between 2004 and 2014, which show that an expansion in these programs did contribute to improvements in these areas. So we can draw an inference that if these programs have not been supported enough, we will not see those kind of human development improvements that we saw in the previous decade continue right now. Just two more on this budget. If you look at the budget, the share of budget for children is at the lowest. Now, again, it's just 2.3% of the entire budget. And this is an analysis that Ritika Kera did recently. It came out in the Indian Express, which looks at the flagship schemes of the UPA, which is the previous government, and the NDA, which again shows that the UPA schemes, particularly the NREGA and the public distribution system, the employment guaranteed public distribution system, once again, as a proportion of GDP, the spending has actually been going down. This increase, the rise that you see in 2021 is, of course, an impact of COVID. So we have this situation where the support for these programs have been reducing, and where there is this whole discussion on freebies and how this government does not believe in those. And at the same time, you have a contradictory situation where certain schemes which have become very political post-COVID, like the public distribution system, where free rations are given, which was not a new scheme of this government. In fact, in 2015, when they came, they wanted to stop it. Those are now continuing and becoming rebranded and being shown as part of this government's interventions. Just one or two things other than the budgets that I wanted to highlight in how is the social sector intervention different of this government compared to previous governments. Firstly, it is true that many of these have been neglected for a very long period. But what we saw is that between 2004-5 and 14-15, because of a lot of many things, social movements, civil society pressure from the Supreme Court, there was an expansion. There were a number of rights-based legislations that were passed, and we were moving to a scenario where these were not doles that are being given out by the government, but actually entitlements, and that they were rights. So you had the right to education, you had the right to employment, you had the National Food Security Act. But what we're going back to a situation where it is doles, and they're even called, it's called Bharti, which is basically beneficiary. So from rights holders converting people into beneficiaries of largesse of a government, and that is the way many of these things are sold. At the same time, in these broad areas of health and education, you see an increasing push towards privatization. It's not as if this did not exist earlier, but it is even more, it's stronger now and much in many different ways faster. So you have in higher education, for instance, the privatization has been immense. In health, the increasing spending is more on health insurance schemes, which includes being able to take treatment from private hospitals rather than standing public institutions. And along with privatization, there is also this sort of silent communalizing of government schemes. I'll just give one example, that there's a recent move where all the health subcenters, which is the first level of care that people access, are now called Arogya Mandirs, which is health temples. So, and then the state governments are told that if they do not paint these boards and if they don't call them Arogya Mandirs, they will not get the health budget. So there is this larger sort of agenda of, and all this is seen as part of Indian culture and not communal, but that comes into provision of basic services as well. The other aspect that Nitin spoke about is also something that we see in the budgets, that on the one hand, where we see stagnating and even declining budgets for basic services. On the other hand, if you look at the revenue side, for instance, you see that the effective tax rates that the rich pay has actually been going down. Post the slowdown, post COVID, with all the sort of incentives and waivers that have been given by the government's own accord, the effective tax rate that a company making profit over 500 crores faces is less than the effective tax rate that a company making 1 to 5 crore profit faces. So we have that difference also continuing. The final point related to social sector that I wanted to discuss, which I think is, again, the silent, sinister way of bringing in an agenda of a communal agenda into social welfare policy as well, is this way in which this government has been talking about universalization and saying that, for instance, the most recent budget speech by the finance minister said things like what they are doing is real secularism in action, and said social justice is necessary, but at the same time said that there are only 4 major castes in the country, and that is the poor, the youth, the women, and the farmer. In some ways negating the kind of caste-based differences that Nitin just talked about, and that people of all castes have only one identity, which is the Hindu identity. But then it also then reflects in, for instance, we had special scholarships for Muslim students, which was stopped, saying that now you have a universal right to education. Every child, irrespective of caste and religion, can access government schools. So why do we need a scholarship? If you look at the budgets for scholarships for students belonging to Dalit and Adivasi, SC and ST backgrounds, once again, you see that the budgets there are reducing in the name that now we have universal services for everybody. So you don't need to do these special things, therefore denying the inequalities that exist as well. Similarly, the introduction of the economically weaker section reservations in higher education and jobs, whereas earlier we had only caste-based reservations. Now you have a 10% reservation, which is based on economic standing, which cannot be accessed by those belonging to the lower castes. It's a sort of a reservation for upper castes now in the larger system of higher education and jobs as well. So I'll just wrap up by saying that overall what we do see is a declining sort of priority to the social sector, while at the same time projecting through a lot of propaganda and advertising that is where the government is really good at in delivering welfare services. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dipa, for sharing your insights and analysis of social welfare and policy under the BJP. And in many ways, what you described was already happening, under Modi's chief ministership in Gujarat, which was, one of the constituent elements of the Gujarat model, with low social spending, making overtures to big business and folding in the communal approach within economic and social policy in general. And so now with our final speaker, I invite Jayati to please take the floor.
Thank you so much, Sheba. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to be with this group here in this panel. And since my fellow panelists have already made such excellent interventions, I really have much less to say. I'm going to just make a couple of additional points and try and link this back to the Hindutva thing that Jean was talking about earlier. So in terms of the additional points, I just want to also emphasize that the employment rate has also been stagnating. Jean correctly said that the unemployment rate is not something we should look at. But if you look at just paid employment, that is not people who are described as being work participation, but those who are getting money for what they do, the rates have stagnated and they are abysmally low. So today in India, in fact, it's only about 13% of the women above the age of 15 who are in paid employment, which is really unthinkable in a society that is in an economy that's supposed to be growing fast, and frankly, in any society. So that, combined with the fragility of paid work, the growing fragility, it was always fragile, as has been mentioned, has really meant that wage shares in the Indian economy have dramatically declined, and that has an impact on domestic demand. So there is a macroeconomic implication as well. This inequality is, of course, terrible in its own terms that Nitin has described and Jean has described. And the fact that it is reproduced in the social sector investments is also terrible. But all of this really means that ordinary people have much less to spend. And this has affected domestic demand. It's affected the mass market for basic goods. And this in turn is why we're not getting a rise in the investment rate. Whatever rise in investment we're getting is because of public investment in infrastructure. And I think it was mentioned, basically, this government has been good at building roads. That's really one of the things, possibly the only thing that they have really been doing in terms of the major investment. But otherwise, we are not seeing a revival in terms of even private investment. So even as the same large capitalists who are saying what a wonderful economy and it's all booming, etc., they clearly don't have the faith to invest dramatically in the economy, if in the absence of major government subsidies and support. I want to also just highlight some of the negatives in economic terms of the whole Hindutva project itself. Now, I completely agree with Jean that, in fact, the greatest danger of Hindutva is not in the economy. It is in the complete destruction of our democracy and the poison that is being injected in our society. Nonetheless, there are very specific implications also for economic activity. For example, the destruction of the cattle trade in India, which has really been something quite dramatic, and it has affected a whole range of industries, the dairy industry, the meat industry, the leather industry, which employed millions of workers actually, and in turn has also affected farming, because the cattle roaming the countryside have really created massive costs and disturbance for farmers, and the whole need to encourage these goshalas, etc. So there's been specific impact of some of these things even within the economy. There is also the fact that it has led to a further segmentation of labor markets. India has one of the most segmented labor markets in the world. And we are segmented in every possible way: religion, gender, caste, location, etc., etc., quite apart from the usual stuff about skills and so on. We have now a further dimension to this segmentation, which has got extremely aggravated, and a greater concentration into particular types of occupation, because of certain castes or communities simply not being given access to certain types of employment. And of course, there is the fact that communalism, the propensity to generate riots when they think there could be electoral advantage, and the associated social political instability does lead to a greater sense of insecurity, even on the part of investors. So, for example, small and medium enterprises, of course, they've been suffering in every other possible way because of demonetization, the terrible COVID lockdowns, and so on. But they are also impacted by that instability. And so the aggregate decline in investment, in which declining household investment, which is micro and small enterprises really, is a major part, has also been impacted by this social and political instability created in large part by this communalist drive. I think one question everybody asks is, how do they get away with this? And I think this is really where there's two parts to this. And I think the first part is really about information, control over the narrative, data, and so on. And the second part has to do with Hindu nationalism specifically. But let's look first at the control over the narrative. I think this has been probably the primary focus of this government. The ability to seize and then control the narrative on what they are doing and how terrific it is and how wonderful it is and how terrible everything else is and how anything bad that happens can be blamed on Nehru and his descendants, whereas anything good that has happened even since independence is due to this particular government and to the Prime Minister himself. Now, this involves, at one level, certainly the suppression or manipulation of official data. And this is a very sad fact. Jean alluded to this. It's because we actually had one of the best statistical systems in the developing world. We had really created a statistical system that could work in an informal economy with, very different kinds of labor activities and different types of enterprises. And for this to be destroyed systematically simply because of that urge to control the narrative is really very distressing. There are many ways in which this has occurred. In terms of the GDP figures, Jean showed us the aggregate GDP figures, but frankly, even those are an overestimate for this later period, because of the fact that when the base year of GDP was changed, which happens periodically, the methodology for assessing one of the most important sectors, industry, was changed to move away from relying on, for example, the index of industrial production, which is, indicating how much actually has been produced in industry, to relying on the corporate accounts, relying on companies' reportage of their sales and profits and so on, which is, number one, excessively reliant on the formal sector. Number two, taking for granted that these accounts are correct without any corroborating or triangulating evidence. And there is a lot of research work done to show that this has actually overestimated both the level and the rate of change of industrial production, because we know the formal sector has really intruded on the informal and has grown at the expense of informal activity rather than additionally. Then we've had the suppression of the major consumption expenditure surveys, which should come out every 5 years. It was first delayed by 2 years to 2017-18. And then, of course, the results were not to their liking. The leaked version of that report indicated that, rural consumption had fallen, which is no surprise after demonetization and the terribly designed and worse implemented goods and services tax thing. So it's no surprise that rural consumption would have fallen. But they decided that that's because this survey was no good, even though it used exactly the same methodology. They trashed it. They refused to publish it after it had been approved by the National Statistical Commission. And they didn't actually have a consumption survey until last year. That's the first that they finally did a consumption survey after more than 10 years, after more than a decade. That particular consumption survey, the methodology was changed. We have some indications of how it was changed, but not the full implications. And surprise, surprise, suddenly the fact sheet, it's not even a full report, the fact sheet that has been produced just before the elections shows an across-the-board dramatic increase in consumption, which is quite at odds with the evidence on real wages that Jean has shown us, with all of the other evidence of even sales of basic consumption goods that the companies themselves are reporting. So there is that further thing. Then, in fact, when surveys that they haven't been looking and monitoring very carefully, for example, the National Family Health Survey, come out with results that they don't like, they then punish the head of the institution that produces the survey. So the National Family Health Survey found greater open defecation and worse nutrition indicators than the government liked. So they basically attacked the poor head of that institute, who was suspended and eventually made to resign. And that clearly indicates that whoever is in charge of the next survey will know exactly what is required of them and produce a survey that shows that suddenly all these indicators are very wonderful and going up. This is a peculiar thing because, and furthermore, they also suppress their own internal audit accounts. For example, the Clean Ganga campaign report or any of these other internal audit reports that find serious flaws and inadequacies and gaps in delivery. So these are simply not made available in the public domain. So the government refuses to tell us anything really about it, or what it's doing and its outcomes, or it manipulates or suppresses the data. On the other hand, the government knows more and more about us. There is the other angle about data, which is that data is increasingly used in every possible way, and also in very unsafe ways for ordinary people, to monitor the Indian citizenry and then subsequently to use it for often unsavory purposes. So, Aadhaar is now effectively necessary for everything, for the most basic and essential services. We have seen how the reliance on biometric indicators has deprived millions of workers of their wages, millions of people of their food rations. It's really quite shocking the extent to which the reliance on digitalization and biometric indicators has really meant greater deprivation rather than greater inclusion, which is how it's typically projected, and at the same time enabled much greater monitoring and surveillance. We also know that these data sources are very badly, shall we say, the safety precautions in these are very poor. And therefore, periodic reports of Aadhaar leakage. I myself was the victim of a major scam in the SBI when a lot of our accounts had to be frozen because there was a major data leakage, which was not made public. I was only informed about it 6 months later because I was a victim of it as well, unbeknownst to myself. So there is also the other aspect of it, that the government doesn't reveal data about itself, its functioning or the outcomes, but it gathers data on individuals and on the citizenry at large, uses it to deprive certain categories or exclude them, and to monitor and survey others. All of this is also the second part of the narrative control is the control over national media. There are very, very brave outlets, a very few of them, that somehow manage to give the real story. But most of the mainstream media, whether it is the television or the newspapers, etc., are completely suborned. Along with so many other institutions, but the private media are either owned by some of the large cronies or generally go along with the government because of the fear of losing advertisements or the many other sanctions that the government doesn't hesitate to impose on them. So national media is almost completely suborned, barring a few very brave exceptions. But the international media has largely played along as well. And that's shocking at one level. But it's not surprising because the geopolitics of the world at the moment are such that India is very important. India is critical for the Western alliance, for sure. It's critical as a bulwark against China. It's critical in many different ways. And so pretty much leaders of G7 and so on have indicated that they're willing to allow the Indian government to do anything it likes to its own people. They're not worried about human rights or basic democracy and so on and so forth, so long as they go along with the broader agenda of the Western powers. And I think that has been a major element in this, ability of Mr. Modi to present himself and India as Vishwa Guru and that kind of thing, because the global leaders have learned how to play the prime minister. They've realized that a bit of flattery and a bit of helping his domestic agenda will then enable them to get what they want out of him, pretty much, more or less. And this has meant, in turn, that that image is kind of constantly reinforced, that this is a wonderful, booming economy, that everything is, hunky-dory, that it's all excellent, because it's reinforced by national and international media. And as a result, every Indian citizen thinks, well, okay, maybe I'm in a terrible economic condition. Maybe my children can't get a job. Maybe we have to go hungry. Maybe, things are terrible for us, but we are unlucky. In fact, the economy is doing really well. And everything is actually, it's just our bad fate, our bad luck. And that's the strength of this ability to control the narrative. But the second major element, and here I will just end with saying this, is really the whole Hindu nationalist thing. Now, definitely it is true that Hindu Rashtra is a goal in itself for this crowd. That we have to accept. And it's not, it's not that it's only there in an instrumentalist way. They genuinely want and are working towards systematically creating a Hindu Rashtra, a Hindu theocratic state in which others will be second-class citizens. But it also serves as a useful distraction from all of this painful reality that has been described so well by the previous speakers. There is a focus on sentiment, on national pride, on a kind of emotive appeal that, okay, we are once again rising, resurgent Hindus who've been suppressed for thousands of years. And this, because it is repeated so constantly, not just by Mr. Modi and, all of the Man Ki Baats and so on, but also at the ground level by the RSS and by all of the other armies and agents of this program, that it's kind of almost become subliminally accepted. So you can talk to many ordinary people across the country saying, yes, this is bad, that is bad, but they have given us Hindus a sense of pride again. It's a very common thing to hear from all kinds of people in all different walks of life and different classes. It also helps people to accept crony capitalism and neoliberalism. I mean, I think we've seen the very adverse effects of this. Jean talked about the sort of new symbiosis between big business and the BJP. But it's very true that, it's an extreme form of crony capitalism, because we know that, the top 100 companies in India get 90% of the profits. Within the top 100 top 5 or 6 companies get more than half of the profits. So it's a really concentrated regime. But how do you get a broader society, which has otherwise been fairly vocal in demanding its, what it thought it was due, to accept this, essentially by diverting them into this thing about Hindu pride and nationalism and so on? Dipa has talked already about how we have moved away from rights back to patronage, back to the gift, the Mai Baap Sarkar and the gift from the state, and particularly from the Prime Minister, rather than the right to food, the right to education, the right to health, and so on. But also this enables the suppression of other social identities, especially gender and caste. And I think this also has been mentioned, that, the caste identities, which remain huge and very, very divergent and extremely discriminatory, economically and socially, these have kind of been sought to be submerged in this larger Hindu identity. And that's why Hindutva is not just a goal in itself. It's actually instrumentally important for the continuation of this particular regime. Okay, let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jayati. That was absolutely, wonderful job that you did in terms of bringing together all these different aspects and facets of Hindu nationalist rule, from, highlighting the big employment problem we have on our hands and how that is creating a structural demand problem in the economy, to actually making us, getting us to think about how Hindu nationalism is not only informing economic policy or the economic effects that are being experienced, but how it is even detracting from its deleterious effects, right? And I think your point about data was really well taken. And you again reminded us that it's not just that the government is not publishing data, but it's actually collecting and surveilling data. And that is also really, dangerous tool that it has. So thank you so much to all our wonderful panelists for sharing their thoughts with us. We had thought that we might engage them on a couple of questions before turning to the audience, but since we're already a little bit over, I thought we might turn to the audience directly. And since we already have some questions in the chat, I'm going to call on my colleague, Dr. Devika Dutt, to pick the questions. Devika?
Yeah, sure thing. So I'm just going to go in order right now. So Raghavendra, can I invite?
I think the digital one has been answered already. So maybe.
Has it?
Hasn't it?
It's up to you. I mean,
Okay.
I thought it would be a good question to
Okay,
ask.
sure. Please then go ahead. Yeah.
Raghavendra, if you want to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question. If not, I'm happy to ask it, just in the interest of time. So Raghavendra Yadav wants to know, can you discuss the role of digital initiatives in driving development under the BJP government in India? I think this question was targeted to Dipa, so, or anybody else can also.
And another question is that is Hindu nationalist good or bad? Other than it, I want to ask, can India be a Hindu nationalist as per the constitutions and other several legal aspects?
Thank you.
Okay.
Do you want to collect a few questions, or do you want to go?
Yeah, maybe we can take 3
Okay.
questions, and
So,
panelists should feel free to address the questions that they think are the most relevant and that they would like to address. Yeah.
Okay. So we have 2 questions already on the table about whether is it even constitutional for India to be a Hindu nationalist country, nation. After that, we have a question from Setu Pels. Do you want to unmute yourself? Okay. Could you comment further on the heterogeneity of these outcomes across states in India? Are there examples or case studies where state-led initiatives have countered or mitigated the observed aggregate trends? I believe this question is also for Dipa, but of course, I think others can also feel free to weigh in. And one more question before we let the panel answer is from Imko Mayenberg. This is definitely for Dipa and others. Would you be able to say a few words on how these social policies are conceptualized in the political discourse? Do you see something like welfare chauvinism found in other nationalist governments, where certain groups, immigrants, religious minorities, the poor, are classified as undeserving, which don't deserve welfare provisions, etc.? Okay, thank you.
Should we go in the order we spoke in?
No, I think Deepa, you should start because there's so many questions for you.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I'll start with the last one on the welfare chauvinism. I think there's definitely that when it comes to Muslims, I gave an example of how the Muslim scholarships have been stopped, but more recently in the context of elections also where the Prime Minister was addressing the Congress manifesto as a Muslim League manifesto, and the whatever the manifesto said about, it didn't really say much about redistribution, it should have, but they did mention inequality and about addressing it. And the way the Prime Minister twisted that, saying that the Mangal Sutras of Hindu women will be snatched and given away to people who have more children and intruders, again, pointing to the Muslim population. So that keeps coming back again and again. It's very much there within welfare. It's not so much anti-poor, but it's definitely anti-Muslim, and that narrative is running parallelly. On the digital issue, I thought Professor Ghosh already addressed it quite a bit, but yes, and probably Jean will also do a little more. On the interstate, just wanted to say that that has always been the case in India again, that there are wide interstate differences. It's not just the North versus the South, but also there are a number of states which have a greater welfare focus than other states, like say newer emerging states other than Kerala and Tamil Nadu would be Odisha and Chhattisgarh and so on. And the states do sort of expand some of these welfare initiatives within the state to countervail the center's effects. But even when we're looking at that, I do want to add that the revenue regime has also been changing, where it is centralizing much more, where the state's capacities to raise their own resources is reducing. And there is this whole controversy around how the goods and services tax revenue is shared with the states and whether that is equitable or not. I don't want to go into it, but what we do see is that the revenue raising is getting more centralized, where the state does not have very many avenues to raise their own revenues, and that limits how much they can spend, which also shows in the share of the cess fund, which goes entirely to the center's discretion, actually increasing as a share. Just one comment I wanted to make on the can India be Hindu nationalist according to the constitution? Of course not. But who is following? The point is that what does one do when the constitution is being violated? I think that is the bigger question here. The constitution is very clear that we are not, it cannot be Hindu nationalist. That's not how it is defined. We, the people, have defined ourselves. Thank you.
Would any of the other panelists like to weigh in on perhaps the digital question or the states question?
Jean, why don't you talk a little bit about the exclusion aspect?
Exclusion?
You know, biometric identity and exclusion.
Well, the question was the role of digital initiatives in driving development. I don't see any initial digital initiatives driving development. I see digital initiatives in various domains, sometimes being helpful, sometimes causing havoc, in particular, as we have seen quite dramatically in the context of various social programs like the Employment Guarantee Act and the Food Security Act, and quite often not making a lot of difference. But I think the important thing is to see digital technology as a means, not as an end. I mean, now it's presented as a kind of end. And the extent of digitalization is presented as a success in itself, without any scrutiny of what it's actually doing to people. So I think this is grossly overrated, as are many related initiatives. For example, Jan Dhan Yojana is being credited with creating hundreds of millions of accounts in a short time. Actually, it has caused havoc in the banking system by leading to the creation of hundreds of millions of accounts that were not necessarily needed or wanted, and that were not linked with Aadhaar properly because there was no biometric authentication when they were opened. And then when it was found that the linking with Aadhaar was faulty, People were asked to go back to the banks with all their documents to authenticate their Aadhaar. Then their accounts were frozen when they didn't meet the deadline, all kinds of things. And so it has created quite a lot of chaos, not to deny that it's useful for people to have bank accounts. But the big leap forward towards financial inclusion had actually been made earlier with the Employment Guarantee Act, which led to the big wave of creation of accounts before Jan Dhan Yojana. And it could have continued in that manner without the kinds of coercive methods that were used under Jan Dhan Yojana, and which created a lot of chaos later on. So I think the benefits of digitization are grossly exaggerated, and the costs are being ignored. I mean, for years now, we have been trying constantly to draw attention to the problems that people face when they are not able to use some of these technologies. How people are being deprived of their pension, of their food rations, of their wage payments under the Employment Guarantee Act. And it's very hard to get any attention to that because the champions of these technologies are not at all concerned with what is happening to poor people. They are concerned with promoting technologies and creating so-called digital platforms that will enable business to flourish. So I think we have to take this digital jubilation with a big pinch of salt.
Thank you, Jean. There was just another question in the chat about what you see as the downside of digitalization, which I think you already discussed. If there's anything more you want to add on that, please go ahead. Otherwise, we can take the next question. Yeah.
Could I just add something?
Sure, of course.
Yeah, so, I think Jean has put it very clearly, but, the point is also that it's reinforcing the idea, which is very much running through all the BJP's approach to these welfare schemes, is first of all, that it's Bharti, that it is a gift from the state, a patronage gift, and that those who receive it have to prove that they deserve it and are inherently corrupt and will try and, sort of manipulate the system to get it when they don't deserve it. That's the underlying principle of all of this kind of control. Because there are ways of using digital technology to improve, corruption down the line. For example, Chhattisgarh, I think it was about 10 years ago, implemented a system of digital weighing of the food stocks and the grains as they were being transported, which apparently dramatically reduced the quote-unquote wastage of the grains through all the different ports of entry. This way of doing it is basically saying that those who are receiving any service or good from the public system are inherently dishonest or corrupt, and they have to be monitored, rather than trying to improve the systems themselves. So, technology can be used in many ways, as we all know. The way this is being used is really to control those who are receiving the services rather than the systems themselves.
I would add that because somebody is asking whether it's the exclusionary side that's problematic. It's not only that. It's also the surveillance aspect, which Jyoti has referred to earlier. And worse than that is how Aadhaar can be weaponized in a terrifying way. Because now the situation is that if you deprive someone of their Aadhaar number, they can't function anymore. And it's very easy. So all the enemies or so-called enemies of the state can now very easily be virtually obliterated just by depriving them under some pretext of their Aadhaar number. This could happen any day, for example, in Assam, against the so-called illegal migrants, especially from the Muslim community. It could happen to the so-called urban Naxals. It could happen to, in a quiet way, to Muslim communities all over the country. You ask them to update their biometrics, you tell them there's a problem, and then they find themselves deprived of their social benefits. So I think it creates a power in the hands of the states that I find totally unacceptable. And that's why we had opposed it right from the beginning on grounds not only of exclusion, but also of surveillance and control powers. I don't think any other democracy in the world would accept such an invasive system.
I want to, in fact, add further to what Jean just said, because what is also especially ironic is that the UIDAI, the organization that actually runs Aadhaar, has made it very clear that Aadhaar is not a proof of citizenship, it's not a proof of address or residence, it's not a proof of anything but Aadhaar. Yet it is linked to everything. It is linked to your bank account. It's linked to your ability to avail any public service. It's linked now when you travel. They require Aadhaar, etc. So it's a very strange thing where the agency that actually supposedly gives you the Aadhaar tells you that it doesn't show anything except your biometrics. And yet all public services and all basic services that are required to live in society today are dependent on that. So it is at the same time something that can be used against you at any time, as Jean has pointed out, but you cannot necessarily use that even to prove any particular status, whether it is citizenship or residence or anything else.
Thank you.
Could I
Thank
just
you.
add one point? Sorry, Sheba.
Go ahead,
With
go
this
ahead,
whole
Dipa.
because I think that also feeds into how this government does welfare. Because of digitization, the other thing that has happened is that holding the state accountable is now also become centralized. You have to hold the computer accountable. Something that's already entered in a digital form is not questioned. So if a person is saying that I did not get my ration, but the computer is saying you got it, there is no way you can, question it and correct it. And the physical records that used to be available in ration shops, now even in Anganwadi centers where child's growth, the height and weight is not available in a register. It's only there in an app. So everything is app-based. There is no face to the state. And that has made accountability and mobilization also much more difficult.
Ma'am, one thing I want to know, India is a leading country in the world in digital economy.
Sorry, Raghavendra, you've already had your chance to ask 2 questions. I'm sorry,
Okay,
we need to take other questions now. Thank you. There was one great question that I would like the panel perhaps to address before we go around and let everybody sort of say their closing piece. And but before that, the question is, what are the undesirable continuities in economic policies between the UPA and NDA, and what changes do we want to see in the future? And perhaps that is a question that Jean is also in a good position to answer, or any other members of the panel. And just to throw in one more question, what would an alternative development model, rather than what the current government is following, what would that look like? And is it possible to achieve under this sort of corporatized Hindutva structure that we have at the moment? Thank you.
So I think there are many undesirable continuities, but if you ask me to single out one, since we're short of time, I think it's not so much about the policies as about the system. It's the fact that people count for so little. I mean, poor people count for basically nothing. They count a little bit around election time when the political parties go after them and make promises, and sometimes something comes out of that. But most of the time, the system operates with very little regard for their dignity, their interests, their demands, and so on and so forth. And you can see that on a day-to-day basis all the time. We have seen it in a dramatic way during the COVID crisis. I mean, I'm still shocked, even though I knew that the schooling system was pretty bad. But the way children were abandoned by the schooling system for 2 years without anything serious being done for those who were not able to continue studying online. Total reliance on online learning. And then when the schools finally reopened, virtually nothing being done for the children who had forgotten all the basics that they had learned earlier. I mean, this is absolutely criminal. And there are all kinds of things like that all the time. So I think that is chronic problem in Indian economy and society. And linked to that, I think what Dipa has talked about, the neglect of social sector and health education and so on and so forth. About alternatives, well, first of all, following on what I've just said, I think there's a lot one can do even within the existing system. I mean, if we would just pay a bit more attention to people and treat them a little better, we could also do things, for example, to address the inequalities that Nitin has talked about, including taxing the rich and so on. We could go some distance at least. But in the end, I mean, if you're talking of an alternative, if you really want to do something serious about economic inequality and about the failure of democracy that we're seeing, not just because of Hindu nationalism, but because of this incompatibility between democracy and the inequalities that develop under capitalism, then we have to democratize the economy itself. And I think on that we need a separate webinar. But this is really, to me, that's the alternative. It's not for tomorrow at all. But that's the direction in which we can go. And there are actually a lot of very interesting initiatives around the world, especially in Europe, but also in Latin America, even for that matter in the US, some even in India, of democratization of the workplace and worker management of enterprises and so on and so forth. I think we have good reasons, both theoretical and empirical, to be confident that we can go quite a long way, if not the whole way, in democratizing the economy. And then I think democracy will begin to make sense. But what we are seeing today is not democracy.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you. Very sobering remarks, but very well taken. Nitin, may I call on you to answer or to make any closing remarks, either to address the alternative model or to make any other closing remarks if you wish.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I wanted to sort of make an argument related to education. So I am kind of working on this long run education development, comparing China and India, and some sort of startling things, which is kind of visible to all of us, but we somehow tend to ignore it. So, for example, today our tertiary level graduates, they're kind of, they can compete at the world level, but it's very surprising that even today we have 30% of population as completely illiterate. And then if you look at illiteracy in China, it has been sort of removed from its 1990s cohort and so on. So one thing is that in education, of course, like post 1990, there has been much more sort of emphasis on primary education. But as John pointed out, that in recent years, because of COVID and all that, and also because of the rapid expansion, the quality sort of deteriorated, and nobody, at least let's say in a planned way, wants to talk about it or wants to sort of improve this situation. And I guess this is, in long run, it's going to hurt us more and more. Like India wants to sort of develop or let's say grow faster, but we have this human capital restriction where there is a limit to it and we cannot sort of go beyond it, or we cannot compete with China. And this is, yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Nitin. Thank you. Dipa, I can turn to you.
I think everything's been said. Just to say that the alternative, again, is not just an immediate short-term alternative of changing the government, but really decentralizing and democratizing the economy. So we have to then think about it very differently. So growth is not the main goal, but also bringing in environmental concerns, gender, care, issues we didn't talk about, that these are all centrally economic issues. And how will they be part of the new economic model?
Thanks, Dipa. And Jayati, you can have the last word.
Thanks so much. Yes, I think, everyone has said it all already. Fundamentally, the problem has been the broader economic strategy. You can call it neoliberal, you can call it crony capitalist, whatever it is. But this is a strategy that has persisted over the last 3 decades, which is that you rely on large capital and big business, and you incentivize them and subsidize them in different ways, hoping that then they will invest and generate jobs that will trickle down. The old trickle-down argument, which hasn't really worked anywhere ever. But that has pervaded the economic approach of the current government, of course, but even the previous government. And that has to change. There is no question about that. That is the thing that we have to absolutely change. Even remaining within a market-driven framework, we have to, number one, control and regulate the markets. Number two, prevent the extreme inequality through fiscal mechanisms, taxation and sub-transfers and so on. But number three, change what is called a pre-distribution, so that the ability of large business to constantly use the state to maximize its own profits, to grab surpluses, to grab resources, to grab land, to grab people and exploit them through segmented labor markets, that is reduced. And that means two things. It means a significant increase in three things. Okay, a significant increase in public investment and expenditure for a whole range of things, especially the things that Dipa identified, health, education, nutrition, and so on. It means a significant increase in regulation of private activity, so that the pre-distribution is altered in a way that would be more achievable. A focus on employment generating sectors through public investment, which is financed through things like wealth taxation, taxation of large corporates and multinationals, windfall profit taxation, and so on. But essentially look at employment generation sectors, because those are we are desperately in an employment crisis. I think that goes without saying. And that can only be altered by a significant increase in public employment, creating a level for private employment to respond to.
Thank you so much, Jayati. And, inflation and unemployment have been the two big issues in this election as well. So, everything that you're saying is absolutely vital to this moment. Anyway, I'd like to bring this to a close. We've gone a little bit over time, but not too much. Thank you so much to all our great panelists who brought their erudition and their years of research and expertise on the Indian economy and talk to us and share their insights. We really appreciate your taking the time to do this. I've learned a lot from this, and I hope that members of the audience have also found it useful. In parting, I'd just like to tell you a little bit about the Association of Heterodox Economics. It is a learned society that aims to promote open and tolerant debate in economics through a pluralist approach to theory, method, and ideology. We regularly host webinars on current topics, and our annual conference is taking place from 10 to 12 July at the University of West England in Bristol. So I hope you'll check us out online and you'll participate in our events. Thank you very much for everyone for attending today, and I look forward to seeing you at future webinars. Thank you so much. And thanks to Devika for expertly handling the tech.